If you close your eyes, you might hear the quiet ticking of a clock. Somewhere far away, gas lamps flicker in the misty London air. It's the mid-1800s, the Victorian era, a time of horse-drawn carriages, tall hats, and thick fog that smells faintly of coal. The world was moving fast then. Factories were rising, trains were roaring across the countryside, and for the first time, the average person could buy cheap food right on the street corner. It was a revolution for the taste buds, and a slow disaster for the stomach. Imagine walking down a London street on a chilly evening. Your breath turns white in the cold air. You pass by rows of market stalls, women calling out hot pies, fresh bread, sweet treats for a penny. But the truth was, none of it was really fresh. And sweet didn't always mean safe. Back then, there were no health inspectors, no ingredient lists, no best before dates. If a baker wanted to make old bread look new, he could. If a candy maker wanted to save money by adding something extra, he could. And he often did. You see, sugar was expensive, painfully expensive. So, to make candies colorful and sweet, sellers turned to whatever they could find. To make green candies, they used arsenic, a lovely bright green poison that could also kill rats. To make red ones, lead oxide, which looked beautiful but slowly destroyed the body from the inside out. Kids would line up after school, holding a penny to buy those bright little sweets, and no one had any idea that they were eating slow death in tiny doses. It wasn't just candy, though. Milk was another quiet danger. Real milk spoiled fast, within a day or two. So dishonest sellers added chalk to make it whiter, and water to make it last longer. Imagine a glass of cold milk that's half river water and half white powder. People drank that every day, thinking it was pure. And bread. Bread was the heart of every meal. But white bread was seen as elegant, a sign of wealth. To make poor quality flour look white, bakers mixed in alum, a chemical that gave it a bright color and a soft texture. Too much alum, though, made people sick, stomach cramps, weakness, sometimes worse. But no one wanted brown bread, so everyone kept eating the soft white poison. Some historians later said that the Victorians were slowly poisoning themselves, one meal at a time. And the strange thing? They didn't even notice, not really, because it was normal. Everyone's stomach hurt sometimes, right? Everyone got headaches. Everyone felt tired. That was just life in the city. If you could walk those foggy streets now, you might see a little boy sitting on a step, licking a green candy that shines under the gaslight. He smiles because it tastes good, sharp, sugary, exciting. His hands are a little dirty from the soot in the air, but he doesn't care. He's alive in a time when color and sweetness feel new and magical. He doesn't know that his candy was made from copper and arsenic and crushed chalk. No one told him. No one told anyone. And that's how the Victorian world worked, full of wonder, invention, and quiet danger. A world that built the modern age, while secretly feeding itself a daily dose of poison. Now take a slow breath. The street fades away. The gas lights dim. The sound of horses fades into the mist. We'll continue our sleepy journey next into the dark, dusty kitchens of the Victorian food makers, where the recipes got even stranger. The story continues not in the marketplace, but behind it, in the quiet, shadowy rooms where food was made. Not shining, clean kitchens, but damp, crowded spaces filled with strange smells. If you opened a door back then, you might find a baker stirring a bowl of dough with his bare hands, sweat dripping from his forehead, and rats running along the rafters above him. It sounds terrible, and it was, but to the Victorians it was normal. The Industrial Revolution had changed everything. Cities were growing faster than anyone could control. Hundreds of thousands of people moved to London, Manchester, Birmingham, all hungry, all looking for cheap food. And when there's demand, there's always someone ready to make money, even if it means cutting corners. There were no clean tiles, no running water, no gloves or hairnets. A pie might be made from meat that had been sitting out for days, its smell hidden by heavy spices or gravy. A sausage might include, well, not just meat, bits of gristle, fat, and whatever the butcher had left over from yesterday's scraps. One writer in the 1850s joked, "Never ask what's inside a sausage, or you may never eat again." And yet, people ate. They had to, because cheap food meant survival. One of the strangest things was how much colour mattered. Victorians loved bright, beautiful foods. A pink cake meant luxury. A yellow pudding meant freshness. But natural colouring was expensive. So the cooks and factory owners turned to chemistry. And that's where the trouble really began. Let's take a look at a jar sitting on a dusty shelf. It's filled with a fine green powder. Shields green, they called it. It looked wonderful, like crushed emeralds. It was also mostly arsenic. Cooks mixed it into sweets, icing, and even pickles to give them that irresistible colour. No one thought much of it. After all, a little colour never hurt anyone, right? In the same cupboard, another jar. Bright yellow powder, lead chromate, used in mustard and candies to make them glow like sunshine. The more vivid the colour, the better it sold. Children loved it, adults too. It looked cheerful in a grey, smoky world. The irony was painful. The very colours that made food beautiful were the ones that slowly killed, a little each day. Headaches, stomach cramps, skin turning pale. People thought it was the weather, or bad air, or simply the price of living in a big city. But it was the food. Even tea wasn't safe. Real tea leaves were expensive, so some sellers reused old ones. They dried them, coloured them with green dye, and sold them again. In some cases, they didn't use tea leaves at all. They just used dried tree leaves, tinted to look right. People drank it, smiled, and said, "Ah, a fine cup." If only they knew. And milk, poor milk, kept finding new ways to deceive. Sometimes the sellers skimmed off the cream and added chalk and plaster to thicken it again. Mothers fed that to their babies, thinking it was wholesome and pure. But the little ones grew weak. Doctors called it summer sickness. It wasn't the heat, it was the milk. Still, the Victorians didn't stop, because no one told them to. There were no rules, no inspectors, no warnings, only whispers. A merchant complaining that his customers were dying.
a doctor noticing too many children ill after eating sweets. But who could prove it? Science was still young, and chemistry was both magic and mystery. So, the people kept buying, the cooks kept mixing, and the factories kept churning out their colorful, deadly delights. It wasn't until one small, tragic event, a few children falling mysteriously ill after a birthday feast, that someone began to ask the right questions. But that part of the story we'll save for next time. Now, as the sound of the old city fades and the fog thickens outside, let your mind wander from those dark kitchens. You can almost hear the faint rattle of a carriage, the whistle of a train in the distance. We'll return soon to the moment when Victorian science finally woke up and the people realized that their daily bread, their sweets, their milk, and even their tea were all slowly killing them.
Dr. Arthur Hill Hassall sat alone in his small laboratory, the flame of a single lamp flickering against the glass jars on his table. Outside, London was wrapped in mist. The sound of carriage wheels echoed faintly in the street below. Inside, under the soft glow, Hassall leaned closer to his microscope. What he saw would change history, and perhaps save more lives than any hero with a sword ever could. He had begun testing everyday foods from the markets: butter, bread, pickles, coffee, mustard, and even sweets. And what he found was filth. Pure, horrifying filth. In one sample of coffee, he discovered baked peas ground up to stretch the supply. In another, iron filings, yes, tiny bits of metal, used to give a darker color. In pickles, he found copper salts. In mustard, lead chromate, the same yellow poison used to paint walls. And in the milk, a swirling mixture of chalk, dirty water, and cow's hair. It was a quiet kind of evil, not done out of hatred, but greed. Each little deception saved a few pennies. Each little poison slipped past unnoticed, until Hassall began writing everything down. He didn't shout or accuse. He simply wrote reports, calm, methodical, terrifying reports, and published them in The Lancet, the famous medical journal. For the first time, the public could see what they were eating. People were horrified. Imagine opening your morning newspaper and reading, "Your daily bread may contain plaster. Your sweets are tinted with arsenic. Your mustard glows with lead." It was too much to ignore. Suddenly, mothers began throwing out candies. Shopkeepers were questioned. And in Parliament, a few brave politicians started to listen. But change was slow, too slow. The food sellers argued, everyone's been eating this for years, and they're fine. Factory owners insisted, the colors are harmless, it's just tradition. But Hassall kept testing, and his results kept proving them wrong. He became known as the food detective, a man who fought with glass slides, ink, and truth instead of weapons. He didn't have power or money, but he had evidence, and once truth starts spreading, it's hard to stop. Around the same time, another voice joined the fight. A stern man named Thomas Wackley, editor of The Lancet. He stood behind Hassall, publishing every finding, refusing to be silenced. Together, they turned quiet science into a public storm. By 1855, after years of their work, people demanded action. The newspapers cried out, "Something must be done." And finally, Parliament listened. The first Food Adulteration Act was proposed, a law to protect people from being slowly poisoned by their own groceries. It wasn't perfect. In fact, it had little power at first. There were no real inspectors, no harsh punishments, but it was a beginning, the first flicker of light in the long, dark story of food safety. And as the years rolled on, others followed Hassal's example. Young chemists, doctors, and reformers began to see food not just as comfort, but as chemistry, something that could heal or harm depending on what it contained. Still, many Victorians didn't trust science yet. Some thought Hassall was overreacting. "Poison in my bread?" they laughed. "I've been eating it for years." But science has patience, and the truth, once revealed, never goes back into the shadows. Now the gaslight flickers again. Hassall blows out his lamp, leaving the tiny room in darkness. Outside, the city sleeps, not yet safe, but no longer blind. In our next part, we'll step into the streets and factories that began to change under this new light. We'll see how the public slowly learned to demand better, and how the first whispers of modern consumer power were born.
When the first whispers of Hassall's discoveries reached the markets, the reaction wasn't gratitude. It was panic. And then, anger. The shopkeepers felt betrayed. The factory owners felt accused. And the customers, well, they didn't know whom to believe anymore. Imagine walking into your favorite bakery, the one that smells of warm bread and sugar, and suddenly wondering whether that golden crust is full of chalk dust. Or buying your usual pickle jar, but remembering that it might be glowing green because of copper, not cucumbers. The trust that held the Victorian food culture together began to crack. For some, it was business as usual. They kept saying, "Don't listen to the scientists. They exaggerate everything." It sounded familiar, because even today, people say the same thing when profit is threatened. The richer merchants hired lawyers and lobbyists to protect their trade. They argued that regulation would ruin honest business. They claimed the public didn't want change. But in the smoky back rooms of Parliament, a few politicians quietly disagreed. One of them was a young man named John Simon, a public health reformer, who believed that good food and clean air were as important as roads or armies. He had seen too many children die from mysterious fevers that began with bad milk or tainted bread. He read Hassall's reports like they were battle plans, maps of invisible wars fought in kitchens and shops. He began pushing for inspections, for trained chemists to test food before it reached the market. But again, money spoke louder. The merchants said testing was too expensive. The government said, "We can't interfere in trade." So, the poisons stayed. Meanwhile, new inventions made the problem worse. Factories could now produce food on a massive scale. Canned meat, bottled sauces, preserved fruits. It looked modern, exciting, clean. But the truth? No one really knew what went inside those cans and jars. Sometimes, to make spoiled meat look fresh, workers dipped it in a solution of sulfur dioxide, a gas that could bleach out the smell. Sometimes, milk for infants was thickened with starch or sugar syrup because it looked more creamy. And jam? Many jars contained no fruit at all, just apple pulp, colored red and flavored with something vaguely berry. It was the birth of fake food, and the Victorians were the first to taste it. But people were beginning to wake up. Pamphlets spread through the city. "Beware the bright candy. Don't drink the milk too white. Color can kill." Slowly, the middle class, the readers, the letter writers, the mothers, began to demand cleaner food. They wrote to newspapers, to Parliament, to anyone who would listen. And while the poor still had little choice, the cry for reform grew louder every year. By the late 1860s, things began to shift.
Small towns hired their own food analysts, chemists who could test samples for chalk, copper, and lead. And some local courts began to fine dishonest sellers. Not much, a few pounds perhaps, but it was a start. Still, progress came slowly, like a cautious sunrise through the smog. There were so many factories, so many stalls, and far too few people checking them. Asal himself had grown older, his hair turning gray, but he lived long enough to see the difference his work had made. He once wrote, "The public has begun to understand that food is not merely a pleasure, it is a trust. And that trust, once broken, would take decades to rebuild." But change was coming, pushed by new science, louder voices, and something else entirely: advertising. The same new century that brought poison and profit was also about to discover branding, the power of promising pure, safe, and scientifically made food. In our next part, we'll step into the strange new world of Victorian marketing, where soap was sold as medicine, tonics claimed to cure everything, and pure became a word worth millions.
A low, steady hum, gears turning, pistons hissing, metal clanking. The smell of oil and sugar, of something sweet and metallic at the same time. This was the new world, the factory age. By the late 1800s, food wasn't just cooked, it was manufactured. And for many Victorians, that felt like magic. You could buy jam in glass jars with perfect labels, condensed milk in shining tins, soda water that fizzed like laughter. No more trusting a street vendor or worrying about a spoiled pie. Now, everything came from modern industry. But inside those walls, behind the polite factory tours and smiling posters, the truth was still sticky, smoky, and dangerous. Let's step inside one. The air is warm and thick. Steam drifts from great copper vats where syrup bubbles. Men and women move fast, stirring, lifting, sealing. The floor is slick. No gloves, no masks, no airflow. Everything is done by hand and hope. Sooter dust floats through the air. Sweet, yes, but also choking. Workers cough, their clothes stiff with syrup. And every few minutes, a supervisor walks by with a stopwatch. More output, faster, cheaper. In one corner, a young girl of maybe 12 years old wraps candies. Her fingers are stained blue from the dye. No one told her what's in that powder, only that if she works hard enough, she might keep her job another week. And in another room, great machines grind cheap meat into paste for pies. The smell is almost unbearable. So they add spices, nutmeg, pepper, salt, anything to drown out the truth. The Victorians believed in progress, and the factories looked like progress. But for every shining tin of pure preserves, there was another jar full of artifice. To stretch the fruit, they used apple pulp and beet syrup. To thicken the milk, gelatin and chalk. To color the candies, lead, arsenic, and copper salts still found their way in. Even when the law forbade it, inspection was rare, and temptation was everywhere. And yet something was changing, not just in science, but in people. For the first time, consumers began to feel powerful. They wrote letters, formed small associations, talked about rights and purity. Newspapers printed warnings, pamphlets explained what chemicals did to the body. And the middle class,
the heartbeat of Victorian respectability, began to demand something cleaner, something truly modern. Out of that demand came the rise of trusted names, brands that promised safety. If you saw a certain label, you could breathe a little easier. Companies like Cadbury began to advertise not just taste, but morality. Their chocolate was pure, honest, made in spotless factories. They even built entire worker villages, where cleanliness and faith replaced the filth of London's slums. For the first time, brand loyalty meant more than flavor. It meant trust, and sometimes even faith. But even those new brands had secrets, because purity was expensive, and greed never sleeps. Behind every bright label, there were still hands stirring vats, still barrels of cheap additives waiting in the shadows. The world wasn't yet safe, just prettier. As the century neared the end, food looked perfect on the outside, but the line between nourishment and illusion was thinner than ever. The Victorians had built the foundation of the modern food industry, the same system we live with now. Convenient, efficient, beautifully packaged, and sometimes quietly dangerous. The stage was now set for the next transformation. A new kind of food, a new kind of control, and a strange comfort in letting machines decide what we eat.
The year is 1901. The old century has ended, and London hums like a great machine. Electric lights glow where gas lamps once flickered. Horses still pull carts through cobblestone streets, but automobiles, noisy, smelly, thrilling, have begun to appear. Science has become a kind of religion. People believe that chemistry can solve anything: hunger, sickness, even death itself. And so begins a new obsession: scientific food. If you walked into a pharmacy then, you'd see shelves of glowing bottles, each promising miracles. Elixirs that restore energy, powders that build blood, tonics that cure all diseases of the stomach. Most of them were, quite literally, flavored alcohol and sugar, sometimes laced with cocaine or morphine for that healthy rush. People didn't know. They trusted the labels. After all, the bottles looked clean, the fonts elegant, the claims impressive. Science couldn't lie, could it? Advertising was the new magic. In magazines and newspapers, smiling mothers held bottles of syrup and said, "It keeps my baby strong." Famous actors endorsed digestive biscuits and pure tonics. Doctors' names were printed boldly, even when no real doctor had ever approved the product. And the public, wearied from centuries of sickness and hunger, wanted to believe. They wanted to think that progress meant safety. Meanwhile, the factories had grown even larger. Food now traveled miles by rail, sealed in tins and glass jars. It looked sterile, perfect, futuristic. But that same distance also meant invisibility. No one saw where it was made. No one knew how. Behind the scenes, the same shortcuts continued. Flour whitened with chemicals, beer preserved with toxic additives, canned meats soaked in dyes to hide rot, and jam was still the same, thickened with cheap pulp and sweetened with whatever syrup was cheapest that week. But something new was stirring again, this time across the Atlantic. In the United States, reformers like Harvey Wiley, a soft-spoken government chemist, began to test American foods the way Hassel had done half a century earlier. He discovered borax in meat, formaldehyde in milk, salicylic acid in wine, and coal tar dyes in candy. It was the same story all over again. A brighter, faster, deadlier version of the Victorian nightmare. Wiley started something called the Poison Squad. He recruited healthy young volunteers and fed them meals laced with tiny, measured doses of common preservatives. They kept careful notes of how sick they became. It was dangerous work, but it proved what everyone suspected. The modern miracle of preservation came at a hidden cost. The newspapers loved it. Cartoons showed young men in uniform bravely swallowing poison for science. And the public, once again, woke up, shocked to learn that progress had poisoned the pantry. By 1906, thanks to Wiley and a growing public outcry, the United States passed the Pure Food and Drug Act, a law inspired directly by the earlier British efforts. For the first time in both nations, it became illegal to sell food and medicine that were misbranded or adulterated. The world finally began to demand truth on its labels. But even then, loopholes lingered. Manufacturers learned to bend the words. Pure didn't always mean pure. Natural could still mean chemical. And safe, well, that was always a matter of opinion. Still, the change mattered. For the first time, science wasn't just the tool of the seller. It belonged to the public. Inspectors, analysts, and journalists started to work together. The quiet fight that began in a London lab with Hassel's microscope had become a worldwide movement for honesty. The age of Victorian poison was ending, but the age of industrial food had only just begun. Now, as the 20th century dawns bright and confident, humanity stands at the crossroads, one path leading toward convenience and profit, the other toward truth and safety. And somewhere, deep in the heart of every kitchen and factory, that old question still lingers in the air. How much do you really know about what you eat?
The early 1900s were full of invention and promise, but also hardship and upheaval. World War I arrived like a dark storm. Suddenly, cities that once smelled of sugar and coal now smelled of smoke and fear. Food became a weapon as much as a necessity. Civilians, soldiers, and children all felt the pinch of scarcity. Rationing began. Bread, meat, butter, sugar, all carefully measured, carefully distributed. Mothers lined up at early hours to receive their family's share. People learned to stretch small quantities, to make meals last, to survive on less. And yet, even in scarcity, people craved pleasure. They wanted taste. They wanted sugar. And where there is craving, there is opportunity. Enter the early junk food industry. Candy, chocolate, and sweetened drinks began to appear in new forms. Companies realized that even a tiny treat could be irresistible. It was cheap to produce, easy to ship, and could lift the spirits of exhausted workers and hungry children alike. Chocolate bars became compact energy boosters, sold as both delicious and healthy for the weary body. Gum appeared on street corners, flavored and colored with bright synthetic dyes. Even bread and biscuits were sweetened in ways that made them last longer on shelves. The public loved it. They trusted the shiny wrappers, the clever slogans, the promises of energy and happiness. And the manufacturers? They quietly cut corners whenever they could. A bar of chocolate might contain less cocoa than advertised, but more sugar. A soda might bubble with flavor, but with artificial coloring and preservatives that no one fully understood. And candy for children? Brilliantly colored, intensely sweet, and sometimes toxic in ways no one realized. The factories hummed. Machines rolled, heated, mixed, and stamped.
Workers handled chemicals and flavorings with little protection. And outside, the streets were lined with advertisements promising joy in a wrapper. It was an era of contradictions, more science than ever before, and yet less public knowledge of what was really in food. More regulation, slowly taking hold, but still far from complete. People were learning to eat quickly, cheaply, and with excitement, often forgetting the lessons of Victorian poison. This was the beginning of the modern junk food age. Sweet, fast, cheap, a distant cousin of the bright arsenic candies of the past, but now industrialized, packaged, and global. And as the world moved toward World War II, rationing would return, and food would become a matter not just of taste, but of survival. This created strange inventions, substitute ingredients, fortified foods, and convenience meals that promised safety and nutrition, but sometimes carried hidden dangers of their own. So, if you picture the 1920s and 1930s streets, children with candy in their pockets, families buying canned luxury items at the market, soda fountains buzzing with teenagers, you were seeing the first fully modern junk food society. It was bright, colorful, and cheerful, but the lessons of Victorian poison were still whispering in the shadows.
World War II arrived with urgency and hunger. Nations mobilized, cities were bombed, and every meal became a matter of survival. Rationing returned with a vengeance. Sugar, butter, meat, milk, all carefully measured. Families waited in long lines for their weekly portions. Children learned to enjoy mock foods, flavored powders mixed into water for cocoa, substitute meats made from soy or oats, biscuits baked with less fat and more filler. The factories adapted quickly. They began producing convenience foods, designed to last long on shelves, to travel to soldiers overseas, and to feed civilians under strict rationing. Canned soups, powdered eggs, instant coffee, all designed for efficiency, not flavor. And yet, the human craving for sweetness and indulgence never went away. Candy bars, chocolate, and fizzy drinks were still made, sometimes rationed themselves, sometimes reserved for soldiers' care packages. But the post-war era, however, brought something new. As soldiers returned home, the world celebrated. Factories shifted back to civilian production. The chemical industry, which had produced preservatives and flavorings for war, now turned its attention to mass-market convenience. Processed foods exploded onto grocery shelves. Brightly colored cereals, ready-to-eat snacks, packaged sweets, all designed to be fast, attractive, and modern. Sugar, salt, and fat became the tools of indulgence, and the advertising industry made sure every family knew about them. The lessons of Victorian poison were fading. Science was no longer just a watchdog. It was a marketing tool. Food could be sold as fun, fast, and safe, even if the inside still carried hidden dangers. Factories hummed louder than ever before. Machines measured sugar, flour, and chemicals with precise efficiency. No workers stirred vats by hand. Instead, conveyor belts and automated mixers created endless streams of uniform products. Everything looked perfect, safe, and modern. But the truth was subtle. Convenience and taste had won over nutrition and natural ingredients. Coloring, flavoring, and preservation were no longer secrets. They were selling points. People enjoyed their snacks without thinking about what was inside. By the 1950s, the seeds of modern junk food culture were fully planted. Bright cereal boxes, candy bars, fizzy sodas, instant meals, all mass-produced, heavily sweetened, and packaged for maximum appeal.
Children grew up expecting flavor, color, and fun in every bite, and the adults, nostalgic for sweet comfort, happily complied. The Victorians had started the journey with arsenic-colored candies. Hassel had begun the fight for truth. Now, industrial food and marketing had transformed it all into a global obsession. And yet, the story was not finished. Even as families celebrated convenience, the subtle dangers of over-processed food quietly lingered. In Part 10, the final sleepy chapter, we'll drift gently into the late 19th century, exploring how our love for convenience and sugar shaped modern diets, and why looking back at Victorian junk food helps us understand the snacks we eat today. Would you like me to start Part 10, the final sleepy chapter, now?
The 20th century rolled on, each decade bringing new inventions, new flavors, and new ways to package food. Television entered homes, and with it came bright commercials for cereals, sodas, and candies. Supermarkets replaced markets, shelves stacked with colorful, convenient, mass-produced food. Families reached for snacks that promised energy, happiness, and ease, without a thought for the lessons of the Victorian past. But if you look closely, the echoes are everywhere. The bright candies of the 1800s had evolved. Lead and arsenic were gone, replaced by artificial colors and preservatives. But the formula was the same. Make it sweet, make it colorful, make it irresistible. Chocolate bars, sugary cereals, fizzy drinks, all descendants of those green glowing sweets that once lined Victorian streets. Processed food became faster, cheaper, and more abundant. The human craving for flavor, excitement, and comfort became an industry. Marketing and advertising turned sugar and fat into emotional experiences. A chocolate bar wasn't just food, it was a treat, a reward, a little piece of joy. And yet the hidden dangers persisted, not in the form of poison, but in overconsumption, additives, and excessive sugar, modern echoes of Victorian shortcuts and greed. Nutritionists, scientists, and historians now look back and shake their heads. The Victorians didn't fully understand chemistry, and they paid the price. We understand more now, and yet we often choose convenience over caution, sweetness over substance. It's a gentle reminder, a whisper from the past, that what looks delightful may not always be harmless. That behind every brightly colored wrapper, behind every shiny package, there is a story, sometimes dangerous, sometimes fascinating, and always worth knowing. So now, as you lie quietly, perhaps with the hum of modern life far away, think of those foggy London streets, of green candies that sparkled like jewels but carried arsenic, of scientists with microscopes writing reports that changed the world, of factories humming, mixing sugar, flour, and imagination into the snacks we now take for granted. Take a slow, deep breath. Let the story drift from your mind. Feel the fog of history fade like the mist over the Thames. And know that even though humans have made mistakes with food, we've also learned, slowly but surely, to make the world a little safer, a little sweeter, and a little more magical, without the poison. Good night.